Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and logistics enthusiasts from all around the world, I'm truly honored to welcome you today on the webinar on transforming the logistics sector across G20 nations. I'm your host, Samhita Shiledar, manager with RMI's India program, and I couldn't be more delighted to be here with you all today. We have an exciting agenda ahead of us, so without further ado, let's begin. Next slide, please. So we'll kick off today's webinar with opening remarks and much-awaited report launch by Ms. Akshama Ghate, who is RMI's India Program's Managing Director and leading all of our sustainability and decarbonization-related initiatives. Following her remarks, my colleague Chetna Nagpal, Senior Associate with RMI, will share a brief presentation of the overview of the report. After the presentation, we'll dive into an engaging panel discussion featuring experts from across the globe. With that, I would like to invite Ms. Akshama Ghate to virtually unveil the report and share the opening remarks.
Thank you, Samhita. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on transforming the logistics sector across G20 nations. I think undoubtedly all of us would agree that logistics sector is the backbone not only for our nation's economies, but for our global economy. It's playing a crucial role, especially in an era when urbanization rates, population, and economic growth are growing in tandem. The logistics sector in this kind of an era is playing a very vital role in terms of facilitating the movement of goods for individuals, for businesses. And when the debates around sustainability, climate change, clean energy transitions are growing, it's very critical that the logistics sector is following suit. Sustainable logistics, hence, is important than never ever before. It really means transporting, storing, and distributing goods in an environmentally, socially, and economically responsible manner. Sustainable logistics will and should integrate sustainability principles into the design and operation of logistics systems across the supply chain to minimize the negative impacts on society, environment, and economy, while also maximizing efficiency of all this movement. Today, I'm pleased to unveil our report, the Green Logistics Playbook, Sustainable Supply Chain Best Practices for G20 Leaders, which has been put together by our team, which is present on this webinar, and also by a lot of other team members. The report offers 19 solutions to implement sustainable logistic practices across G20 nations. It outlines actionable steps that G20 leaders, including policymakers and also industry leaders, can take to promote sustainable logistics in their countries. G20, as we've seen in the recent presidency of India and the summit, is a very critical group. It represents 2/3 of global population, over 3/4 of global trade and GDP. And it's also a crucial player when it comes to transforming the logistics sector on a global scale. The report that we are launching today offers a playbook of case studies, providing us with tangible insights into how G20 policymakers and also visionary businesses in these nations can leverage global best practices to drive this transformation. Our team has very carefully tailored these solutions, these case studies, to suit the specific needs of G20 policymakers and business leaders. These solutions are spanning across 4 essential areas: policy drivers, logistics operations, infrastructure development, and financial investments. First and foremost, what we strongly are showcasing through these case studies, through the solutions presented in this report, is that businesses can drive bold innovation, research, and development within the sector. By supporting on-the-ground deployment of sustainable logistics measures, the industry can transform how we really move goods efficiently while also minimizing all their environmental impacts. The second important thing that the report is highlighting is around policy drivers. Policymakers can really incentivize efficient logistics practices by creating strong regulatory frameworks. These policies convey robust market signals, prioritizing sustainability throughout the logistics sector, encouraging business to adopt green practices. The third thing that we're highlighting through the report is infrastructure development, which will be very, very critical for a sustainable logistics future. The G20 here, we strongly believe, can lead by example in effectively planning and deploying a network of physical facilities, whether it's goods storage, transportation infrastructure. There is an opportunity to kind of lead by example here in all of these infrastructure solutions, because they will not only reduce emissions, but also will support economic growth. Finally, our report is highlighting that financial investments, of course, will play a very pivotal role. The G20 can encourage public-private partnerships to mobilize funding for infrastructure and sustainability-focused projects. So you'll find a suite of case studies and arguments in favor of how to kind of support financial investments to support a sustainable logistics industry. Overall, I'll conclude by saying that the G20 nations have a tremendous opportunity to lead the way in promoting sustainability in logistics. By collaborating across sectors and implementing the steps we have identified in this report, we can really drive systemic change within the sector, reduce emissions, and create a sustainable logistic economy globally. We are really hoping that this report supports G20 leaders in transforming logistics into a clean, optimized, cost-effective system that drives economic growth. I will now pass on to my colleague Chetna Nagpal, who will walk you through the contours of this report. Thanks.
Thanks, Akshma, for setting the context and also unveiling the report. Hello, everyone. I am Chetna Nagpal, Senior Associate with the India Program. And building on the Akshma's address, I would like to share some insights from the report. Moving on to the next slide. I think we would all agree that sustainable logistics is important considering the sector's impact on the global economy and the environment. The sector contributes to 10% of the world GDP, while also accounting for 10% of the global emissions, posing a major environmental challenge. Furthermore, the sector is expected to grow by 10.7% CAGR from 2023 to 2030. Moreover, the sector increases the risks such as with this tremendous growth, the sector brings increased energy security risks, higher carbon emissions, rising urban air pollution, and adverse health impacts. Therefore, the need for sustainable logistics is not only necessary from economic and environmental point of view, but also for a healthier, secure, and prosperous future. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Now, why sustainable logistics in G20 countries? This is because the G20 have a significant role to play on the global stage. These nations collectively represent 85% of the global GDP and are responsible for 80% of the global emissions and nearly 66% of global population. Hence, their role in shaping the sustainable logistics practices is crucial. This is particularly relevant in the context of the G20 theme for the year 2023, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, One Earth, One Family, and One Future, which also emphasizes the interconnectedness of nations and underscores the pursuit of sustainable, equitable development for all. Moving on to the next slide. Now, we've identified 4 strategies as also covered by Akshma, which encompass logistics practices, policy drivers, infrastructure development, and financial investments. By implementing these strategies, we can streamline the supply chain, reduce the traffic congestion, logistics costs, CO2 emissions, improve the air quality, enhance energy security, and improve social security in the sector. Moving on to the next slide. Now I'll cover each of these strategies one by one. First being the logistics operations. In this, we've come up with 7 solutions to improve operations and mapped some case studies in the map on the right-hand side. First being the corporate sustainability goals. Corporates can set targets, create comprehensive action plans. These could include carbon neutrality targets, circular economy initiatives, renewable energy targets, fleet electrification targets, etc., such as the case study that we've identified, which is the FedEx and their carbon neutral operations by 2040. Second being corporates can invest in research and development in cutting-edge technologies to optimize supply chains, enhance logistics efficiency, etc. And we've looked at Shell Game Changer Accelerator, which is an incubator to accelerate R&D in the ecosystem. Third is integrating sustainable warehouse practices, including energy efficiency, renewable energy integration, and waste management measures. And again, the case study identified is of California's OK Produce, which is a wholesaler dealing with sustainable transportation of goods. Fourth being allowing nighttime deliveries in congested cities with EVs, expanding scheduling for timely deliveries outside the peak hours. And this has already been piloted in Stockholm, Sweden. Fifth being the eco-driving programs, such as those being implemented in Canada to promote fuel-efficient and safe driving practices. Sixth being promoting sustainable and efficient packaging through 3 strategies: reduce, redesign, and replacing. IKEA, which is one of the leading global players, is already undertaking a measure called flat pack packaging to reduce the efficient packaging. And last being load matching and vehicle selection by aligning available cargo with the right logistics provider and delivery vehicle. And the case study that we've identified for this is Freight.com, which is a freight matching platform in Brazil. Moving on to the next slide. Now, in terms of policy measures, we all would agree that favorable policy measures are critical to driving sustainable practices. These could include targets, campaigns, regulatory frameworks, standards, subsidies, etc. First being the logistics policy, which can serve as a guidelines framework to govern the planning, implementation, and management of logistics activities. India, for example, has a national logistics policy, which is aiming to reduce India's logistics cost. Second is zero emission vehicle incentive. Government can implement fiscal and non-fiscal incentives to encourage the manufacturing and deployment of zero emission vehicles. For example, the case study that we've taken for this is a United States Inflation Reduction Act. Third is zero emission vehicle sales and purchase requirement that sets a mandate or requirement for the manufacturing and adoption of zero emission vehicles. And lastly, national awareness campaigns that could be run by corporates in partnership with public players that increases the awareness around the benefits of switching to energy efficient technologies. Next slide, please. Now, infrastructure development, we all would agree that the logistics infrastructure, which includes the physical assets that facilitate the efficient transportation and storage of goods, is crucial in streamlining logistics operations, reducing inventory waste, and also enhancing the effective distribution of goods. Logistics parks, for the first solution that we've looked at, they serve as centralized hubs for logistics activities. Second being industry planning, to create a land use plan such that it designates specific areas for factories, warehouses, and that are located away from residential boundaries. Third being allocated parking and land zones to streamline designated areas in the urban core. Again, low emission zones to restrict the entry of polluting vehicles in the urban cores. Fifth being bypass or dedicated freight routes, offering an alternative route that circumvents the urban core. And lastly, zero emission trucking corridor by deploying necessary charging infrastructure to support seamless travel for zero emission trucks. Next slide, please. Logistics projects usually require substantial capital investments and are often considered high risk due to difficulty in getting access to the finance and capital. So the two solutions that we've identified are concessional finance, which can be provided by development banks at low interest rate, extended repayment period, and flexible terms. And second being public-private partnership between government and industry to plan, finance, and develop projects such as highways, rail systems, freight and logistics centers. Moving on to the next slide. So through our work, we urge G20 leaders to take strategic actions to address the environmental challenges posed by the logistics sector. Here are the 5 actions that G20 leaders can take. First is elevating the importance for the logistics sustainability by integrating it into the formal G20 agenda. Second is forming a dedicated task force to develop comprehensive policy best practices and regulatory frameworks. Third is fostering collaboration and knowledge sharing among member countries. Fourth is establishing measurable targets. And fifth is creating criteria for assessing progress basically on the sustainable logistics. Next slide, please. Now, in this report, we've also looked at what role have different stakeholders can play in enabling sustainable logistics in the G20 countries. Looking at the role the policymakers can play, they can nurture sustainable logistics, introduce policies, develop road infrastructure or any other necessary infrastructure, create public charging infrastructure to support zero emission trucks and other low carbon technologies, create strategic industrial land use plans, etc. For corporations, they can develop their sustainability strategy, allocate resources to drive innovation, implement efficient shipping practices, completely switch to electric or low emission fleet, and even implement energy efficiency measures. Lastly, I think it is very essential. All these solutions can be driven by effective collaboration, and effective collaboration between public and private players can drive awareness campaigns, secure financing for warehousing projects, etc. And some other solutions have also been listed in our report. Now, in conclusion, sustainable logistics is not merely an option, but an imperative for our future. It's a call to action, a commitment to cleaner air, reduced emissions, and efficient interconnected supply chain. And together, we can shape the sustainable logistics future. Thank you. Now, next on the agenda is the panel discussion. So I'll just pass it to my colleague, Samita, to take this forward.
Thank you so much, Chetna, for sharing the insights from the report. We'll now begin with the panel discussion on fostering sustainable logistics practices across G20 nations. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our esteemed panelists for today's discussion, each of them with distinguished expertise in their respective fields, coming all the way from different G20 geographies. First of all, I would like to invite Professor Alan McKinnon. Alan McKinnon is a professor of logistics at the Kuhn University of Hamburg, Germany, and an emeritus professor at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. With an academic career spanning over 44 years, he has conducted extensive research on various aspects of logistics and supply chain management. Notably, he has served as the chair of World Economic Forum's Logistics and Research Program and has also led authorship of Transport Chapter in IPCC's fifth assessment report in 2014. Welcome, Professor.
Yeah.
Joining us next is Mugdha Jain. Mugdha is the India country lead of Clean Air Fund, a philanthropic initiative tackling global air pollution. Mugdha has over 20 years of professional experience spanning advisory and leadership positions in the development across areas such as public health, education, and livelihood. Her previous experience is in corporate strategy, business consulting, and program management, and she also supports social sector organizations on their strategy, models, and deliveries. Welcome, Mugdha. Next up, we have Rick Arends joining from Netherlands. So Rick is the director of Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, a leading initiative of Smart Freight Center. In his capacity as director, Rick works with the largest shippers in the world to accelerate their decarbonization in collaboration with supply chain partners. With over a decade of experience in sustainable transport, Rick has also worked across various parts of Europe and the global south. Welcome, Rick. Perfect. And finally, I would like to invite Mike Roth. Mike Roth brings over 35 years of experience in the commercial vehicle industry and currently serves as the executive director of the North American Council for Freight Efficiency. Mike specializes in implementing green truck collaborative technologies at scale and has served as chairman of board for the Trucking Manufacturers Association. Mike was named as an industry influencer by fleet owners and awarded the prestigious SA's L. Ray Buckendale Lecturer in 2020. Welcome, Mike. Perfect. So we have great panelists along with us coming from distinguished areas, coming all the way from different geographies across the US, different parts of Europe and India. So I would like to start with a broad question for Professor Allen. In your professional work, Professor, you have highlighted that one of the greatest challenges in that logistics managers will have to confront in the future decades is going to be climate change. So sustainable logistics often requires transitioning from traditional linear supply chains to more agile and resilient ones. How can supply chain professionals, in your opinion, design their systems to reduce consumption, eliminate waste, and minimize the environmental impact? A very broad question, but I think that would be a great way to kick off our panel discussion today.
Yes, well, thank you for that question, and congratulations, incidentally, on producing what seems to me a very comprehensive and a very timely report. I look forward to reading it. I think as time is limited, what I'll do maybe is take a supply chain perspective on this and ask, what we can do to cut emissions from supply chains. Really look at two aspects of this. First of all, what can we do to try to reduce the amount of freight movement measured in ton kilometers? And then secondly, what can we do to cut emissions per ton kilometer? So addressing that first question, I think there are 4 things basically we can do to rationalize supply chains to reduce the amount of freight movement. The first, perhaps the most radical, is to digitize things, where we convert freight consignments to electrons, which is a process well advanced in entertainment media and the news and educational course material. That can be pushed further. Second thing is 3D printing. I think people recognize that will allow us to streamline our supply chains, reduce the amount of component and sub-assembly distribution. A third thing would be to make our economy more circular, to move towards closed loop supply chains. And again, the research suggests that would significantly reduce the amount of freight movement. And then the fourth one, which is a bit more controversial, is shorten our supply chains, known by various expressions like deglobalization, relocalizing, reshoring, and so forth. There's a big debate as to what extent, whether this is actually happening, and also what the environmental implications of that would be. But if we're in a climate emergency and we've got to do drastic things, then maybe companies have to think about doing that. And the second metric, if you like, which we want to change is emissions per ton kilometer. And there are various things that supply chain managers can do to try to make supply chains less emission intensive. So one thing you can do, and this was previously regarded as a bit heretical, is simply slow down the movement of freight, right? Which we have seen in the maritime sector, 15 years of slow steaming, which has delivered significant CO2 benefits. As I think Mike will be aware, there are companies in the road freight sector now which are reducing the maximum speed of the vehicles to cut emissions. The other things, we can improve the loading of the vehicles and the vessels as well. And one thing that would contribute to that is that process of slowing things down and relaxing the just-in-time principle, which might result in us building a bit more inventory into our supply chains. But again, if we're very serious about cutting emissions, that's something we may want to consider. Although I would hesitate to push that too far, because what we may achieve then is reducing the emissions from the transport operation, but increase the emissions in the warehousing and in the factories. So if we're going to promote that as a sustainability option, I think we have to do a fairly holistic analysis to look at the net effect of just-in-time on our supply chains. So hopefully that gives you a broad overview of some of the things that we could do in terms of supply chain management.
Perfect. I think that provided a really good framework of how you can reduce the emissions from freight transportation as well as from warehousing and storage. That actually is a really good segue to my second question that is going to be for Rick. So as Professor Allen also mentioned, freight transportation often accounts for a significant portion of logistics cost, significant aspect of logistics efficiency and emissions as well. And one of the key aspects to reduce the emissions from freight transportation is multimodal transportation solutions. Based on your experience, could you provide examples of how G20 nations promoting or implementing intermodal transportation systems to improve the efficiency of movement of goods. If there are any examples that are in your mind or any best practices that you would like to share with the group today.
Yeah, thank you so much, and congrats also on the launch of the playbook on the logistics sector. It is actually, and I think it's some of the questions in the chat that I saw in the Q&A. Actually, it alludes to that if you allow yourself to make the transportation to move by more efficient transport modes, for instance, rail or barge for inland waterways, or for instance, move from air transportation to maritime transportation, you may actually reduce your emissions up to 90% already, simply by nature of that shift in itself. Now, as Alan McKinnon also alluded to it, there is a downside to it, which is generally speaking that some of these modes are slower in their movement. And if you are able as a business model that you can actually reduce that, then this is absolutely great. There's actually, you asked specifically about best practice examples, and there's actually a more prominent example in line with IKEA example that was recently established, where in the European context, IKEA and Inditex. Inditex is a fashion industry company, so they make fashion clothing. They have their hubs centrally in Spain, whilst IKEA has it in Poland in Europe, and they have been actually successfully implementing a railway connection across several countries, and as well as collaborating on a return flow behind them. So they have been able to reduce their empty mileage as well as transition to an intermodal solution accordingly, which has been actually one of the best examples that I've seen so far.
Thank you for sharing that example, Rick. You highlighted on how different types of stakeholders and companies have been working on this particular topic of intermodal transportation. And I would like to ask Mugdha in terms of just the role that different industry players, different policymakers can play together in terms of making this shift, not just towards intermodal transportation, but overall towards sustainable logistics. So throughout your professional journey, you've collaborated with various stakeholders like government, corporations, civil society organizations. Could you elaborate on the role of collaboration that these sectors and these different players can play in fostering sustainable logistics practices such as intermodal transportation? Again, if you have any examples in your mind, if you could share that, or if you could share any significant progress that has been made in any part of the world.
Excellent. Thank you for the question, Samhita, and congratulations on the launch of the playbook. I noticed a very powerful recommendation in your playbook is multi-stakeholder collaborations, which is also very close to our strategic approach, being a philanthropy and playing a catalytic role. We are talking about an integral transformation of logistics practices, right, towards a more rational and effective use of resources across the supply chain. So this covers several macro areas, which essentially requires different key actors in the ecosystem to come together and work towards a shared vision. We intuitively understand that businesses have a role to play in sustainable logistics. They do sourcing, packaging, storage, transportation, so on and so forth. However, if the entire ecosystem or network would take decisions that reinforces and supports the common cause, then the whole can become greater than the sum of its parts. So especially in this case, Akshama already noted in her address that making the shift to sustainable logistics is driven by far greater considerations than economics. For example, there's environmental stewardship, there's social equity. So you mentioned governments. And governments, they provide regulatory support, enforce standards, guidelines, build, incentivize physical infrastructure creation, soft infrastructure like training for workforce, and so on and so forth. Policy support for electrification of urban freight can be a good example, a good case in point for this. Say, for example, in India, at the national level, the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan and has envisaged, as an example, electrification of light commercial vehicles, which is then supported by the 10,000 crore Indian rupees FAME 2 subsidy schemes as an incentive to electric LCV uptake. Then coming to the subnational level, a good example could be IMI's program that supported the Delhi government, the Deliver Electric pilot, which is a wonderful example that comes to mind, in which 1,000 electric vehicles were used for deliveries in partnership with 36 corporations. And indeed, I understand RMI is now supporting the government to leverage learnings from this pilot and develop a roadmap for 100% delivery electrification. So this brings me to the role of civil society organizations, the other key actor that you mentioned, to convene the actors in the ecosystem, facilitate the dialogue, and provide strategic insights, provide technical guidance for governments for creating an enabling and robust policy environment. Civil society can help drive the momentum, can keep us accountable as well, because the solutions that we build today should not have any unintended consequences in the future. Strategic communications, there are behavioral nudges, community engagement. There are several different components actually that civil society can play a great role at.
Thank you so much for sharing those examples, Mutta. I think those really highlighted the role of collaboration in terms of effective policymaking, different kinds of pilots that can be organized on the ground. I want to zoom in a little bit more into the role that industry also can play in terms of decarbonization, especially of the freight movement that you just touched upon. So I would like to ask a question to Mike next. As part of NACFI, you are working with a diverse set of industry players on promoting a shift towards zero emission trucking particularly, and overall efficient freight transportation practices. Based on your conversation with dozens and hundreds of industry players over the last several years, what are some of the promising technologies right now and strategies for reducing carbon emissions in the trucking industry? And how can G20 nations adopt and adapt these solutions to their specific countries based on your experience in the US?
Yeah, thanks, Samita. I believe that the actions are going to be taken by corporates. The actions are going to be taken both to buy vehicles, to consolidate freight, all the things we're talking about are either demand or supply side in the supply chain. So, at the end of the day, that's who needs to make the decisions and that will make a difference. I can be supported in many ways. I do want to talk about zero emission trucks, but I don't want to be a hypocrite on myself because, all three of you brought up some fantastic things that are still, maybe call it low hanging fruit for decarbonizing goods movement. And those are things like slowing down. That's a great point, Alan. And the ability now of intermodal to be more successful than it's ever been in history because of data and transparency of data and ability to know, we literally know where the freight is, where the ship or truck or the driver of the truck. I mean, we know so much about goods movement that now we can make this more of a concert rather than a hockey game of moving freight. And I think that's there's power there and so forth. So I do want to talk about electric trucks in particular, but I do think all of these things everybody's talking about, we can do at the same time. And so I blogged last week that electric trucks are benefiting from decades of diesel trucks. And what I mean by that and meant by that was that we've seen fuel economy improvements, ton mile per gallon improvements, or Alan had the imperial term for that, but we've improved freight movement quite a bit with these trucks. And so now that helps to enable the zero emission trucks. So, I thought it was going to take decades for us to have battery electric trucks, both in urban, smaller truck deliveries, as well as, medium and longer return to base operations, and even more, longer haul, disparate route that we see a lot in the US. But it's coming faster than I thought. We just finished Run on Less Electric Depot, where we saw an battery electric truck do over 400 miles per charge and 1,076 miles in a single 24-hour period with pretty fast charging. And this is a truck that's real, with real freight movement and so forth. So, that's more extraordinary than I expected. And I think, these ZEV trucks, whether they're battery or hydrogen, are coming a bit quicker than we thought. Having said that, there's tons of challenges, many of which, some of the playbook solutions, I think, map to helping these ZEVs be efficient with, and be practical. But all of this is really exciting. And I'll close with, don't be scared of these, whether you're a freight mover or a government thinking about it and so forth. Many days we think that there's just too many solutions for us to handle in moving goods, because there's no failure in moving goods. It's not acceptable to not have, medicines and clothing and food. So we have to do this along with continuing to deliver what the world expects from us in goods movement. But I think we can do it. I think we just need to focus, and we need to look at the right solutions for the right applications and duty cycles and regions and so forth, and get on with it.
Thank you so much for sharing those real-life examples from Ronan Les Mike. That was really helpful in terms of contextualizing as to where exactly the industry is at. I would like to ask next question to Rick, because it's on the similar lines. Given your exhaustive engagement in the global stakeholder ecosystem, including freight buyers, suppliers, and shippers, and your experience across working with different G20 nations, what trends are you observing in terms of sustainable logistics practices, particularly in terms of zero-emission trucking, or anything with respect to warehousing or storage as well, and their adoption across different countries? So where exactly do you see different geographies, especially in Europe and Global South, moving to?
That's a very broad question, but very interesting as well. Let me start with that. Actually, so there's one worrying trend, which is that emissions are still on the rise for logistics, and that's the most, I think, the most worrying part of it, because the effort of logistics is simply increasing. So the demand for logistics is ever growing, and in the years to come, that's actually significantly going to grow. I saw the number was at 11% today. From a greenhouse gas perspective, that is actually going to grow by 40%, unless we really are able to take some of the actions. The benefit of it actually is as I would say, is actually in twofold. On the one side, we see legislation and policies really moving into a direction where it's enforcing, especially in the trucking sector, zero-emission trucks to come to the market more quickly, more rapidly. We've seen the example of California in this case in the US. We've seen in Europe, actually, the ACV legislation that is coming to play in the coming months, actually, we hopefully successfully concludes. But we have seen also the Global Memorandum of Understanding on Heavy-Duty Vehicle legislation that is now signed by, I believe, 28 countries already. So you really see a legislative push which is asking countries and therefore companies to reduce fossil-based trucks and therefore allow zero-emission trucks, battery electric in particular, to run on the market. And I see a second pressure maybe, which is that actually customers and big shippers and big freight buyers are responding in many ways to the clients of the customer demands. So they are actually asked also to have they've set us a really strict target of 50% reduction, 70% reductions by 2030. And we now see that actually those companies that have made this commitment, like almost 2-3 years ago now, are really, they've spent now a few years on building the strategy, are really into the action mode. They're really buying these trucks. They're buying services that are low carbon. And they actually reduce their emissions significantly, sometimes more quickly than they even anticipated, which is a positive trend in that space, I would say. So in that context, I'm encouraged. Final thought maybe is actually that we've seen several of the freight buyers. We've seen a huge surge in this as well. So it's not just anymore about the few leaders, the companies that are mentioned that have been in this space very active. We've seen a real surge in the number of companies that are actively decarbonizing their supply chains or looking to. And there's a big role to play for organizations like Smart Freight Center, but also NACFI and others to help them to identify what is the right strategy and how does that look like at scale.
Thank you so much for sharing those trends with respect to freight movement, Rick. I want to ask next question to Professor Allen. And I think throughout the responses from all of you, we have touched upon different aspects of the framework that Professor had introduced in the beginning. So speaking a little bit about the amount of freight movement, reducing the emissions per kilometer, improving the efficiency of the vehicles. Then we also spoke about intermodal transportation. The other point that, Professor, you had mentioned in the beginning was infrastructure and warehousing as it relates to improving the logistics efficiency. So I want to switch gears a little bit and try to touch upon that topic as well as part of this panel discussion. So as you had mentioned, infrastructure and warehousing and storage of goods are also critical components of the logistics sector, accounting again for substantial amount of costs and emissions. Could you provide some examples of innovative and sustainable logistics practices that can effectively reduce carbon emissions from goods storage in particular?
Yeah, okay. I'm delighted to see in your playbook that you include warehousing, because so often these days people simply equate logistics with freight transport. They overlook the storage and transshipment function. You mentioned they are expensive, so it's estimated that warehousing is about 10% of logistics costs, and it represents about a similar percentage of CO2 emissions. And although I'm always quite optimistic about warehousing, I mean, if you look at the rate at which logistical activities will reach net zero, I think warehousing will get there first. There's an interesting benchmarking exercise. It's called GILA, which collects a lot of data on the environmental impact of warehousing in Germany, Italy, and in Latin America. They reckon, I think, that about 91% of the emissions from warehouses come from energy use, right? And then of that energy, 75% of that is electricity. And warehouses are connected to the grid. So as the grid decarbonizes, so too will warehousing. But they will go beyond that, because there's huge potential for micro generation of renewable energy in warehouses, both from roof solar and also from wind turbines. And you asked for some examples. I'll quote two. One is Nike, which has a big distribution center in Belgium, which runs entirely on renewable energy, right? And then there's one not too far away in a place called Tilburg in the Netherlands, where you are, Rick, which is even carbon negative. So the 13,000 panels, solar panels on the roof, generate more electricity than is required by the warehouse. And it also powers about 750 houses in the surrounding area. So I think that, although we shouldn't just consider the energy transition here, we also have to look at ways of improving the energy efficiency of warehousing. And I think there's significant potential for doing that. A lot of it will be through improving insulation of the warehouses, but also changing the lighting, moving to LED lighting, changing some of the internal processes in the warehouses to minimize the amount of movement of product as well. And then just one final thing I'll mention on warehousing. It also depends where your warehouse is located. And you're taking a global south perspective here. So there are many countries in the global south which are still an earlier stage in their logistics development. Countries like Germany, where I work, or the UK, where I'm living at the moment, we have what I call logistical lock-in to heavy road freight dependency, because the warehouses and the factories have located in points of high accessibility to that network. In Germany, only 6% of warehouses have a rail connection, right? So my advice to those countries at an earlier stage in that process is try to encourage warehousing development in places where you don't just have good road connections, but good connections into the rail network and also the waterway network as well, because that will give you modal shift opportunities in the future, which are now difficult to achieve in more developed countries.
Thank you for sharing some of these best practices. I think that was one of the reasons we had included a specific section on warehousing operations as well as logistics infrastructure as part of the report that we worked on as well. And one of the key levers in terms of realizing these solutions on the ground is the effort from industries, but also working with policymakers in the G20 regions on creating effective policies that support sustainable warehousing as well as sustainable freight transportation. So I wanted to ask next question to Mike. When it comes to transitioning to zero emission freight movement, as well as overall sustainable logistics, how do you think can industry players effectively work with government and policymakers to create an enabling environment for these changes? Are there any regulatory incentives models that in your experience have shown promise? And just based on, again, your experience of working with so many industry players, how exactly can the efforts from industries also be relayed in terms of effective policymaking?
Wow, that's a good one. I think as we look at all these solutions that we're all talking about, as it firms up, I'm not sure that's the right eloquent term for that, but as we understand what's right for each region, market segment, kind of goods movement, then we need to act fast. And so we will have classic S-curve adoption curve folks, right? We'll have these innovators and early adopters that have sort of figured out how to make it work. How do you make a good example? How do you make a battery electric truck work that might have 400 miles of range, not 2,000 miles of range? How do you realistically make that work in operations to advantage the truck driver, the freight movement, et cetera? And so these solutions are going to have different operational requirements. They're going to be better for some things. They're going to be worse for other things. We got to figure out how to make them work. Once that's figured out, then I think it's very important to give these incentives and then the regulations to move faster than we would otherwise to the really the early majority, the later majority, and ultimately the laggards maybe. So I think that's kind of a key classic academic, but also very real situation that we have in front of us right now. So don't go too fast, but really, and there's this saying, right? I want to be a fast follower. That's exactly what I'm talking about here. How do we make sure that that the industry players understand how that solution fits for different market segments, and it's also inappropriate to sort of say it works here, but then it'll work here and make a bad assumption. So we got to figure out where it works, and then move fast. And I think that's where all the collaborators say, yep, that's the case, here we go. And that's when the incentives and regulations coming in in that particular place to make the followers faster. And I think that's how we'll accelerate this. Sounds simple, but I think it's a good framework, but oftentimes difficult to do. There's a lot of players here, right? There's the entrenched who want to keep it the way it is. There's the new, there's a combination of the two. There's all kinds of things that are challenging here, but I think that'll serve us well if we have that thought process.
Thank you for providing that framework for effective and collaborative consultative policymaking, Mike. I want to ask next question to Mukta, just as a follow-up of Mike's answers. Given your extensive work, which is dedicated to clean air as well as public health, how do you think sustainable logistics policies can demonstrate their long-term impact, particularly regarding public health and livelihoods? Could you shed light on the ripple effect and lasting benefits that sustainable logistics policies can bring into these critical areas?
Thank you, Samita. That's an important question. And like Mike, I'm going to say it's also a big one. But it's important to talk about it. So I'll take a stab at it. We're talking about this integrated, coordinated approach for policy development in the logistics sector, right, as a whole, in a pathway towards sustainability. So I'm glad that you asked me this. A number of key concepts need to be identified and linked. So we've identified social well-being and people centricity being one of the critical dimensions. As Rick mentioned, some worrying statistics about how the logistics sector is negatively associated with issues such as climate change, carbon emissions, air pollution. Regulatory frameworks and policies are evolving, I hope with some heightened sense of urgency. Corporates are driving the change and setting climate and circular economy targets for their supply chains and supplementing efforts through their own philanthropy. To address your question, I think it would be difficult to provide empirical evidence specifically linking favorable policies in logistics as to how they're positively impacting human health and livelihoods in the long run, because these interlinkages have been established not so long ago. But a lot of evidence base is slowly emerging in different parts of the world. Now, there are these small studies that we keep coming across. For example, a study conducted by the Keck School of Medicine of USC that showed that increased ZEV adoption in a particular PIN code led to reduced local air pollution and asthma-related visits to the emergency room. So several of these studies are emerging. And I also recently learned that, you mentioned livelihoods. So one thing is about protecting livelihoods, but the green skill, development. I've learned that while the logistics sector is low in green skill intensity at the moment, but it's also one of the fastest in terms of, poised to transition there. So imagine if all of these different interventions that we are talking about were systematically scaled up, integrated, and made coherent with other efforts, we would be able to promote better health of our population, especially those that work and live in the worst affected areas, ensuring these ripple effects, fewer chronic conditions, fewer sicknesses, better productivity, lower absenteeism, all of which will help in protecting livelihoods as well. I hope that answers it somewhat.
No, for sure. I think you really shared the long-lasting impact and the need for this transition towards sustainable logistics and how it can affect the air quality, the public health, as well as the environment, and also the logistics cost, as we discussed previously in this panel. I know we just have 8 minutes left. There are a lot of good questions that we have in the Q&A, but before we dive into those, I have one last question for all of you, and if you can answer in one sentence, that's a challenge, and just considering how much wealth of expertise you have. As an expert in the field of sustainable logistics, how can knowledge sharing and capacity development be made more accessible and effective for a wide range of stakeholders, including smaller businesses and developing nations, as well as more developed nations? So again, just to repeat the question, considering you all are coming from different geographies in the field of sustainable logistics, what is one top recommendation that you would have in terms of knowledge sharing and capacity development to be made more accessible and effective for a wide range of stakeholders? We'll start with Professor Allen.
Okay, as an academic, I'm in the knowledge creation and sharing business, obviously, but much of that, unfortunately, seldom gets to the practitioners. I mean, it appears in academic journals, not widely read outside the academic world. So we need alternative channels, it seems to me, to get the more pragmatic advice to companies and also to government officials as well. And we have a big green freight community, represented here. I mean, NACFA is part of that, and the Smart Freight Center. I think they do an excellent job in producing reports like the confidence reports, Mike, that you're responsible for. And so those channels exist. It's often a question, particularly with small freight operators, small logistics operators who are struggling to survive commercially, to engage them and to raise their awareness. And that's the real challenge. But I think if I can just have 1 minute to plug a report which the World Bank is going to be publishing, which I wrote and is published this week sometime, is looking at how we tailor decarbonization of logistics to less developed countries, to the global south. So what I've tried to do there is review a lot of the practical advice that is available to companies and governments in that part of the world. Sorry for the advertisement. Okay.
Thanks, Alan. That's a really great advice. Over to you, Rick. Any insights on how can knowledge sharing and capacity development be made more accessible and effective?
Yeah, it's actually a super challenging question in one sentence, but I believe actually I would second Alan McKinnon in this particular aspect, that there is actually, it starts, and this is maybe very interesting, that it starts to be super clear about what the strategies for decarbonization are. A few years ago, this was not yet clear. So there are now really great examples of good companies that have done the first pioneering work. And that in itself allows other companies to flow, to be the followers and to learn from those best practices. And I think as an industry company, an industry work as a company, you need to show your leadership. So you're at the top of the food chain. I always say, you ask how your goods to be moved. you're also responsible how they're being moved. And you can now, and you can just read it up, that's not too difficult anymore, how it should be done, and then show your leadership by making that happen. I think that's the biggest ask. So it's not anymore genuinely about just capacity building, understanding, pioneering. It's really about implementation and scaling that accordingly.
Thank you so much, Rick. Mukta, over to you.
I would again second Professor Allen and Rick, exactly this, right? Institutionalization of a co-generated knowledge sharing, best practices sharing platform, because a lot is being done, but in silos. So to coordinate all of that effort and learn from each other, but being mindful that there is some sort of strategy and continuous effort needed to ensure that socialization and continuous engagement from the companies and diverse stakeholders as well. We've done this, it really works. So for example, the World Economic Forum's Alliance for Clean Air, or what we are doing locally here in India, the India CEO Forum for Clean Air, it really works. But if you do marry the platform with some sort of sustained effort on enabling knowledge sharing, I think it would be wonderful.
Thank you so much, Mukta. And Mike, for your closing answer.
Hard being last, but I think for all parties, I mean, treat this like safety. Treat sustainable logistics like you have a safety idea, and instead of hoarding it and benefiting from it, you are compelled to share it because it improves, safety and well-being. That's what we're talking about here. So when it comes to transparency of whether it's early adopters or manufacturers, of course, good ideas should have intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. But wherever possible, share those learnings, get that out. We don't have time to not do that. So I would say just all players treat it like safety and share and move on.
Thank you so much, Mike. I could go on with the conversation, but there is a lot of engaging conversation happening over the chat. So I'm just going to take a couple of questions from there. First question from Gopesh is, what will be the role of financial institutions in the sustainable transition to logistics sector as it involves a plethora of challenges? Any of you would like to address this question? So the role of financial institutions.
Maybe it's actually, can I,
Yeah.
especially in relationship to Alan McKinnon's remark on the SME operators, what we've seen now, this is the trucks that, and specifically about road freight sector, they are becoming 3 times more expensive and gradually coming down, but in total cost of ownership perspective, they're just as efficient. But those costs have to be borne, and financial institutions and leasing solutions are a critical solution in that space. And we see financial institutions now actually jumping on that wagon and providing those solutions more rapidly than before. And we see a plethora of solutions accordingly happening. So financial institutions are important, but not critical, I would say, in this space.
Thanks for offering that perspective. The next question is from Mark, and it is for Mike. The most efficient way to provide charging infrastructure is to put enough solar PV on both rooftops and on canopies over both parking and driveways to meet the demand on site. Any remarks on this or any thoughts?
Yes. I mean, solar on every square foot of flat surface you can have or you can make, right? So, a great example is a canopy over your charging stations. These trucks are big, and you put a trailer on them, they're really big. And so if we can, put a canopy over top, protect the truck from the solar loads, a black truck gets 17% more solar than a white truck. So paint them white, first of all, but also cover them with solar. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's a great idea. And we've seen incredible cost improvements around solar. It's a great idea.
Perfect. And I'm going to squeeze in one last question, which is combination of several. Any thoughts from Alan or Mukta on role of hydrogen or catenary or moving road transportation to rail in terms of sustainable logistics?
Left part, okay. I'm more supportive of catenary than I am of hydrogen. I know, again, some people think this is science fiction, but we've got very successful trials of catenaries of electrified highways in Germany and Sweden. The studies that have been done suggest that longer term, this is the most cost-effective way of decarbonising road freight. But I know it's fairly contentious to say that, and some people would disagree. Hydrogen has a role, but a very marginal one, it seems to me. Given the improvements in battery density and the economics of battery, I think that most of the decarbonisation of road freight, certainly in smaller countries, is going to be battery related. It's only in the longer countries where I think there may be some need for hydrogen fuel cells. But that's a personal view. I'm keen to get Mike's reaction to what I've just said.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I know we don't have time, but I think battery electric trucks have a head start, and there's a lot of improvement. Technology is really nascent. Fast charging, hydrogen will be part of the solution, but it'd just be a matter of how much when it comes to road transport and a few others. So I'll close there. We have another webinar on that sometime, Smita.
For sure, we'll definitely plan that as a continuous series. Thank you so much for all of your time. Big thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you, Professor Allen, Mugdha, Rick, and Mike. I would also like to thank the entire team who has worked really hard in terms of the execution and launch of today's report and ensuring a seamless execution of this webinar. And finally, I would also like to thank all of the participants who have attended the webinar. Your engagement, questions, and enthusiasm have made this event a dynamic and collaborative platform. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you soon. And we have shared the link of the report on the chat, and we'll share that with all of the participants shortly. Thank you.